Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a seriously fascinating paper by author Ryan McLean titled Before I Formed You, I Knew You. We're going to be exploring a massive, kind of mind-bending mystery. How exactly we perceive time, how we define our own origins, and whether the way we typically think about our existence is, well, fundamentally missing a much larger picture. Get ready, because this one is definitely going to shift your perspective.
So let's just dive right into it. When does a person actually begin? I mean, it sounds like a totally simple question, right? Most of us would immediately point to our physical birth, or maybe conception. We just naturally assume our personal timeline starts right there, at point A. But the source material we're looking at today challenges that deeply held assumption right out of the gate, suggesting that our starting line might not actually be where we think it is.
The absolute core tension of this paper is brilliantly illustrated by a very specific text from Jeremiah. And this verse completely breaks our standard chronological assumptions. Just notice the order of the words here. Before I formed you, I knew you. You see, the text doesn't say I knew an idea of you. It literally says I knew you. It places a real personal relationship completely before physical formation even happens.
Which brings us to Section 1, the chronological assumption, or living in timeline brain.
Now, normally we experience life in what McLean playfully calls timeline brain. It's that purely sequential march from birth to death. We move step by step from one moment to the next, and from the inside, it feels like that timeline is literally all there is. But here is where it gets super interesting. The paper points out multiple glitches in Scripture. These are passages where Jesus and the prophets speak completely outside of this chronological frame. They're talking as if the rules of local sequence just don't apply, addressing people and events in a way that simply does not fit into our standard start-to-finish timeline.
So how do we make sense of this? Well, the author uses a method called constraint-based theological reconstruction. Think of Julia Child's famous rule for recipes. Operational trials under normal, everyday home kitchen pressures are the only way to genuinely see if something works. Similarly, this method tests our theological assumptions directly against the actual text to see what survives the pressure. You don't start with a theory. You start by letting the raw text constrain the possibilities.
And here's the kicker. When subjected to this pressure test, the standard chronological origin model completely fails. Why? Because it literally forces readers to add words to the text that just aren't there. To make our standard timeline work, interpreters often have to change "I knew you" into something like "I knew about you" in my foreknowledge. The paper makes a really strong argument here. If you have to constantly add invisible subtitles to make your model work, your model is probably broken.
To solve this, the paper establishes two totally different frames of reference. The first is chronos. Now, chronos is the ordered progression through measurable duration. It's our local sequence of events, and the paper emphasizes that this is entirely real. Our birth, our daily struggles, our growth, our earthly history, all of it. But while chronos is absolutely real, the author argues it is not the ultimate frame.
We have to contrast chronos with what the author calls the father's frame. This is the completed relation and total structure of a timeline, viewed completely from outside local time. The paper borrows a really great analogy from modern relativistic physics to explain this. Imagine a local traveler experiencing a journey step by step, while an observer looking at the entire map sees the whole world line all at once. Neither perspective is wrong, right? They're just observing the exact same reality from different frames.
Let's move into Section 2, the arcade analogy, or playing Roy. To make this incredibly complex metaphysical concept a bit more accessible, the author introduces a brilliant analogy from the animated show Rick and Morty, specifically the arcade game called Roy. So inside the game, a character named Morty puts on a VR helmet and suddenly he becomes Roy. Roy wakes up, goes to school, gets a job, pays his taxes, and experiences pure Cronus. From inside the game, Roy genuinely believes that Level 1, being born in the hospital, is the absolute, undeniable beginning of his entire existence. He is completely trapped in timeline brain.
But if you take a step outside the game, the perspective completely shifts. From the arcade, the larger frame, Rick can clearly see that the player, Morty, existed way before the game started, and he's still going to be there when it ends. The player's core identity is completely stable before, during, and after the bounded timeline mission of playing Roy. The mission in the game is real for sure, but the arcade itself is the ultimate reality.
All right, Section 3, testing the theological rules against John 10 and 17.
Now let's apply that arcade rule right back to the source text to see if it actually holds up under pressure, without us having to add extra words.
In John chapter 10, Jesus says, "I have other sheep that are not of this fold." Notice he doesn't say, "I'll manufacture sheep later," or "I really hope to get some sheep." The text points out that he already possesses them well before they are visibly gathered on the timeline. It proves a prior relationship. Basically, he is speaking from the arcade, not from inside the game.
And we see this reinforced again in John 17. Jesus prays to the Father regarding the disciples, saying, "They were yours, and you gave them to me." Once again, the continuous persons already belong to the Father before ever entering their earthly mission. It's the exact same they. Their identity remains completely intact across both frames.
So this builds into a really clear, reconstructed biblical pattern. Step 1 is prior possession, which is followed by calling, then recognition, following, and finally gathering. The paper makes a fascinating point here. Sheep don't become sheep by hearing the voice. They recognize the voice because they already belonged to the shepherd. It's almost like an awakening within the timeline to a truth that existed totally outside of it.
Which brings us to the core claim of the entire paper. 2 frames, 1 reality. Scripture consistently preserves one continuous person. The same you known before formation is the exact same you formed in time, sent into the world, and eventually gathered. It perfectly maps your local chronological journey right against the eternal stability of the Father's view.
Let's look at Section 4, Crossing Death, the Exit Point.
So, how exactly does this framework handle the ultimate boundary in Chronos, death? Well, under the standard timeline model, death is a hard stop. It's the end. But the Father's frame model completely flips its meaning, shifting it from a final destruction to simply being an exit point of the mission. The paper notes that Scripture literally says the believer has already passed from death to life. It's spoken of as an accomplished fact. Under this model, physical death is just an event on the local world line. To go back to our analogy, it's just a game over screen for the Roy mission. It's like taking off the arcade helmet. Sure, it is definitely the end of the local timeline experience, but it is completely powerless to destroy the continuous person who belongs to the Father.
And finally, Section 5, the grand conclusion, the same you.
The true biblical pattern ensures that our earthly life is absolutely not a simulation or some fake illusion. The game of Roy is a very, very real mission. It's just not the whole story. The person inside the timeline and the person in the Father's frame are continuously, beautifully, the exact same you. And just to make sure this model doesn't veer off into denying physical reality, the author rigorously pressure tests it against strict Catholic doctrine. And guess what? It passes. Creation is preserved as a direct act of God. Physical embodiment is treated as a vital and deeply meaningful mission, and the ultimate resurrection of the body is totally maintained. The physical timeline profoundly matters. It just simply isn't your ultimate origin point.
All of this leaves us with a truly mind-bending paradigm shift. We've looked at the constraints of the text, the reality of Chronos, and the massive overarching scope of the Father's frame. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If your deepest identity doesn't actually begin on your local timeline, who were you before the game started? It's a fascinating question that absolutely warrants reading McLean's original paper. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning your frames.